Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. And we are happy to welcome a new contributor to today's show. His name is Oliver Dean. He is joining us from London. Oliver, great to have you on the program today.
Thank you, Brian. Great to be here.
All right, so I know that you're a Young Voices contributor. That's pretty remarkable in and of itself, but I'd like you to take a moment and tell our audience just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Of course. So I'm entering my second year at the London School of Economics, LSE. I'm involved in a lot of organizations there, campaigns, societies there, particularly the LSE Hayek Society. And I've just kind of got this general interest in, politics, economics, international relations, all of that type of stuff, and offering my insight on it.
Very good. And it's always good for me as an American to get an insight into what is happening in the UK. Now, I only recently became familiar with the name Keir Starmer, but I understand he is the Prime Minister of the UK. And you mentioned in the article that I'm looking at here from Comment Central that he had a mission to clean up British politics. And I'd like you to set the stage for us a little bit about why was that a priority for Starmer? And then let's talk a little bit about how there may be too much of a good thing when it comes to overhauling the rules.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the biggest characteristics of the previous government, the previous Conservative government, was that there was a lot of corruption and cronyism and scandals that were essentially defining Britain on the global stage. So the biggest examples were mainly David Cameron, who was involved in Greensill Capital, and Owen Paterson in 2021, which kind of contributed to the downfall of Boris Johnson's government. And essentially, Keir Starmer has portrayed himself to the public in the run-up to the general election as this person who is, tough on crime, he's tough on corruption, he's going to restore faith to public office. So he was a former director of public prosecutions. He prosecuted a number of terrorists during his time as a lawyer, and he's essentially portrayed himself as this change candidate to the Conservatives, who was seen as, just enabling cronyism and corruption in the highest echelons of British politics.
Okay. So, well, I can, on the one hand, I can certainly agree. Well, if there's cleaning up to be done, then by all means, let's get it done. However, you make the case in your article that if the Labour Party is to push through some of the reforms that Keir Starmer is calling for, there may be some unintended consequences. Let's talk about what those might be.
Yeah, so the main consequence I've pointed out is that in the reforms that the Labour Party have suggested, one of the things they want to enact is to restrict the employment opportunities of former ministers such that they can't go in and work on areas related to their previous policy briefs. So, for example, a minister who was working in the Department for Transport, let's say, would not, after leaving government, be able to go and work in a transport-related industry, a transport-related role. And so on the surface, this obviously seems like, a well-made solution to the problem of corruption and cronyism in British politics. My argument, however, is that this simply won't work. Ministers are privy to information, they have experience in these sectors, they have expertise, knowledge, and they should be able to provide British businesses with this knowledge, with this expertise, to help them manage in such a competitive economy. And my argument, therefore, is that without this expertise, without this knowledge being provided to British businesses, they will essentially fall behind the likes of foreign competitors and other organizations. And so British businesses will essentially be on the back foot if Labour pass this legislation.
Oliver, I can certainly see your point about not leaving worthwhile expertise on the table, when they could offer, a good insight and help. However, how do we draw a clear line between utilizing their expertise and their experience versus basically just taking advantage of connections and taking advantage of government service to enrich themselves?
Yeah, and I think this is, one of the key questions that comes out of this article. But I think what we need to remind ourselves is, what actually constitutes lobbying, who engages in lobbying. And there seems to be this common misconception, not just from, people in the media and so forth, but in the public in general, that lobbying is this big industry where people in suits walk around Parliament and Westminster making shady backroom deals and so forth, like you pointed out. But I think what we need to realize is that this could not be further from the truth. If I finish this interview and I go and email my member of parliament and I say to them, I want you to vote a particular way on a particular piece of legislation, I've effectively just lobbied my member of parliament. When Stonewall pressured the government, the coalition government between the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats to legalize gay marriage, they had pressured the government and they had lobbied the government. And so I think when we talk about, this conflict of interest, this using personal connections for personal gains, I think we really need to temper that conversation, and we need to recognize that lobbying can have a, profoundly positive impact both on our politics and on our society more generally.
Okay. And I'll admit, maybe what is kind of tainting my view a little bit is what I have seen, particularly in American politics, where politicians will spend, a long time of their career as a legislator or something like that. And then immediately upon exiting, Congress, they go and they become a lobbyist for various industries that benefit from the policies made by Congress. And that's probably where I get my impression that, well, this could easily be abused. Now, at the same time, I appreciate you bringing out the nuance that, but there are serious problems that these individuals will have insight into. Talk to me about some of the biggest challenges that Parliament is facing right now, and what might these new lobbyists or some of these experienced lobbyists bring to the table in terms of solutions.
Well, I think there's been a number of examples as well in recent history where we've had former ministers going into these positions of lobbyists and these positions in organizations to bring their expertise to the table. So one of the biggest issues is obviously foreign affairs issues, so whether that be in Ukraine and in the Middle East. And if we go back about 14 years when the previous Labour government actually left office, David Miliband, who at the time was Gordon Brown's foreign secretary, left his post as foreign secretary after Labour lost the election, and went on to become president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, which has worked tirelessly over the last 14 years to help thousands of displaced people around the world. So there are obviously real world examples as to where former ministers can provide this expertise and provide this help. And I think we need to shift the conversation towards that instead of only focusing on the bad apples and the negative experiences.
And I appreciate that you point out there's a difference between NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and simply big business. And again, with my apologies to members of parliament and the lobbyists there in the UK, in America, it just seems like there's a huge crossover between big business and lobbyists and former legislators who go into the lobbying field, and sometimes that leaves a very bad taste in my mouth. How well received is this on the part of the public in the UK, as far as, obviously, if there's need for reform, there must be some kind of drive from the public that is pushing that. Are they open to what's being suggested by Keir Starmer, or is there some resistance on their part as well?
I mean, there's not been any precise studies going out to this public and asking them, are you supportive of Labour's lobbying reforms? But what we can infer is that through Labour's massive success in the general election, they scored a landslide victory, more than 400 MPs, that their proposals must in some way be well received. But what we also need to consider then is, are Labour actually popular, or was it just a protest vote against the Conservative government to get them out of office? And I think when we look at it like that, then the question becomes a lot more difficult to answer, because we're not necessarily arguing that Labour's reforms are positive, but just that they were the only alternative to the Conservative government that had failed the country.
Very good. Again, we are talking with Oliver Dean. Oliver is a new contributor to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Oliver, for people who want to follow your work, where can they find you and where can they connect with you on social media?
You can follow me on LinkedIn. Just look up Oliver Dean. It will have history and politics at the LSE and Young Voices contributor. I've also been advised that it's good for me to get a Twitter account, an X account, to publicize my points. So you can also follow me on there. I'm sure I'll be posting on there soon.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Mickey Horstman back to the program. He is a Young Voices contributor. You've heard him on here before, but Mickey, for the sake of people meeting you for the first time, tell us just a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I am the communications associate for the Illinois Policy Institute, a libertarian-leaning think tank based in the city of Chicago and the leading voice for taxpayers in Illinois.
That's got to be a challenging position. Not trying to stereotype here. I'm just saying Illinois, you've got your work cut out for you.
Yes, famously the land of good fiscal decisions and high moral politicians.
And of course, as you and I were talking about before we jumped on the air here, you're going to be hosting the Democratic National Convention here before long too. That's got to bring some pretty different vibes as well.
Yes, we are rapidly approaching the start of the convention dates next week, so it'll be a crazy but hopefully safe time in Chicago as hundreds of thousands of people pour into the city to see the presumptive nominee Kamala Harris walk into the convention center and take her place as the Democratic nominee. So
now I'm looking at a piece you wrote for the Chicago Tribune about concerns about youth turnout. Talk to me about when the Democratic primary took place earlier. What was the turnout as far as the youth vote or the young people vote?
Yeah, so Chicago during the primary season had a historically low turnout. But this wasn't really surprising. We saw kind of a disengaged audience in a liberal city with an incumbent president. There wasn't much incentive to turn out to vote for a primary, especially one held in March with a little cold weather. A lot of opportunities for people to pass this off and say, oh, I don't need to come out. But candidates shouldn't be ignoring young people and their concerns going into the general election in November, especially members of Gen Z who are historically more engaged than other young audiences and young voters were at their age. So in the 2022 midterm elections, Gen Z actually had historic turnout. Which is unusual for a young generation to turn out with rapid participation rates for a midterm election, let alone off cycle. So for candidates to engage with young people in the same way in the way that they have in years past would be not smart for either candidates going into this election cycle because they account for a very large voting block. I believe it's 1/5 of the electorate is made up now of Gen Z and young voters, which is a very significant portion of people who are expected to turn out to vote. And like we saw in the midterms, they are engaged and willing to vote.
So I have to ask you this. What is your impression of the motivation of those Gen Z voters with Kamala Harris, in the picture now rather than Joe Biden? Does that shake things up?
I think it definitely does. We've seen, if social media is any indication, we've seen a huge uptick in just different types of social content that either in support or against Kamala Harris and her campaign. But there's definitely been a shift in the electorate, a shift in the mindset of young people who maybe had grown tired with some of the Biden administration's policies, who maybe were concerned about Joe Biden's age going into this election cycle, concerned about it being more of the same. You'll definitely see young people turn out at, I would say, a higher rate than even was expected if Joe Biden stayed in the race. I think this kind of reignited youth voters to participate. It seems like now this is going to be a more competitive election. And the candidates are aware of this and they're doing everything in their power to engage with them, which is the right way to start. In the past, we've seen candidates who have been rather dismissive of young people and young voters' concerns, but that's not what we're seeing this cycle. We're seeing both presidential candidates engaging with young voters on their platforms, particularly on social media. Vice President Kamala Harris has engaged viewers by leaning into Brat Summer, which I have had to explain to many members of my family the origins of Charlie XCX Brat Summer. And Donald Trump's been doing the same. He's been going on podcasts with different celebrities. He's been trying to reignite some support from young conservatives. At the RNC, brought in some celebrities like Amber Rose, Jason Aldean. Kamala Harris, like I said, has been really prevalent in meme culture and trying to engage in that capacity. And both candidates are engaging more successfully than previous candidates. I don't think it's surprising now with the way that social media has evolved into our day-to-day lives, that's the way that most people can receive their news. That's the way that young people especially are engaged with politics. They're exposed to it at an earlier age, which is largely why they are more likely to vote and be engaged than some of the past generations. And the candidates know this, and they're trying to engage with them on their own terms and avoid some of the Pokemon go to the polls of past generations.
So let's talk for a minute, Mickey, about what are some of the issues, or what are some of the things that are driving that engagement of young voters?
Yeah, shockingly, I think a lot of people have this perception of young voters that they really only care about highly like political or divisive issues, but that's not the case. Largely for the average Gen Z or young voter, the thing that they care about most is affordability, which mirrors what larger and older generations also care about. So when different polling organizations, including Harvard, including Vox, have done these expansive polls on young voters, they found that when you compare something like lower prices to things that you would associate young people care about, like the Israel-Hamas war or student debt or climate change, by and large, the vast majority of Gen Z and young voters care about lower economic prices. So there are ways that candidates can appeal to that would be a good first step to branch out and trying to engage this electorate who's been largely ignored in previous elections. So where that can start is housing affordability. Housing affordability is a huge concern for young people. In 2022, nearly 60% of Gen Z were house burdened, meaning they contribute more than 30% of their income towards housing costs, which is a much higher percentage than past generations. And that means that they're not saving as much. So when they're renting at 30% of their income, that means they're tightening down their wallets, that they can't go out and contribute to the economy, can't go out and buy more things, can't save money to buy a house and to enter that type of market. So there are some policies that candidates can engage with, including some zoning reform and other types of cutting red tape and other restrictions on housing things to encourage growth, which is the most effective way to combat rising housing prices, is to build more. In Chicago, we're actually seeing some efforts to do that now, which is good. Additionally, they care about high tuition costs. Something the candidates can do is extend a program for student loan forgiveness that the federal government offered, which allows businesses to actually pay up to $5,000 of student loan debt tax-free. So this is a good tax-free incentive that should incentivize businesses as a sign-on offer for young candidates or young voters getting into the job market. But that's ultimately the biggest concern, is high-paying jobs. Candidates, especially younger or young voters, were particularly pushed towards college and taking on massive student debt. But that's not always the best route for a lot of young people, and they don't see that until after they've tacked on all this debt. So making sure that there's good, high-paying jobs available and cutting barriers to that. These are the things that candidates care, or that young voters care about the most, and probably candidates should be engaging with on a day-to-day, in addition to the social media outreach. We want to see meaningful policy reform.
Well, and I'll be keeping a close eye on this too, to see how these candidates, especially coming out of the Democratic convention and as they move into the home stretch, see if they respond to those issues that are key to Gen Z and young voters. Again, we're talking with Mickey Horstman. He is a communications associate for the Illinois Policy Institute, also a writer for Young Voices. Mickey, for people who wish to follow you or connect with you on social media, how can they do that?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Mickey_Horstman, or you can follow the work I do at the Illinois Policy Institute at illinoispolicy.org.
Thank you so much. I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We're happy to welcome James Erwin back to the program. He is I guess we can call you a regular contributor now, James. You've been on here a number of times. Good to see you again.
Great to be back.
So for those meeting you for the first time, take a moment here and toot your horn a little bit. Tell us who you are and what you do.
So my name is James Erwin. I live and work in Washington, D.C. as a professional swamp creature, writing articles about tech policy, freedom of speech, and telecom issues. And have been published in National Review, Washington Examiner, Washington Times, many other venerable publications that I am slipping my mind right now, but I assure you I am a big fan of all of them.
Okay, and we're going to be talking about an article that you wrote for the Washington Examiner about European tech protectionism and some of the unintended consequences that come along with that. But before we get there, last night there was a pretty big conversation between Elon Musk and former President Trump on X. And my understanding is that the European Union actually reached out to Elon Musk beforehand. Tell me about the letter that was sent to him.
Well, when Europeans crush their own tech industries and outlaw freedom of speech in their own countries, they then turn to what they do best, colonialism. And they try and export these policies to other countries. So basically, there is a law in place that applies to the entire European Union. It's very similar to the domestic laws that the member states have passed, and former member states, including the UK, have as well, which is relevant to the political turmoil going on in their streets right now. But basically, you can't post freely online in Europe. Some bureaucrat has to approve of the tone of what you're writing. You cannot be accused of inciting hate. Obviously, I don't like when people incite violence online either, but this is not a case of direct incitement to violence. Like, many of these are just what they believe could theoretically create a context in which their politics might become more rowdy and unstable. And you can understand why, as a bureaucrat, you don't want rowdy politics, because that would imply some sort of democratic oversight, or that the people are not as corrallable as you think. But anyway, after applying this to their own countries, their next mission is to make sure the entire world, including Americans who have a much more robust First Amendment, a much more robust constitutional protection for freedom of speech, have to abide by it too. So this fellow named Thierry Breton, rely on my high school French, hopefully got that right, is a Frenchman, or perhaps a Belgian, not quite sure, who is a Eurocrat, an apparatchik of the European Union, sent a rather creepy but also comical letter to Elon Musk just the other day. It said, officially warning him not to give Donald Trump a platform because he's too controversial a figure. And if he does, there are extradition measures they could go to arrest him. But I think the more reasonable threat was that they were going to do something to restrict X's ability to do business, or Musk's other companies such as SpaceX and Tesla. He's got his finger in many pots. He's got his eggs in many baskets. He's a great entrepreneur that I think deserves respect for what he's been able to bring to the market. But that means that many governments have many pressure points that they can apply to him. And so basically they're threatening to go after his businesses if he gives a platform to the person they do not want to be president of a country they do not live in.
Wow. Well said. That was a great description. I actually read the letter and was struck by how Orwellian and ambiguous a lot of that language was regarding, this could lead to some unforeseen problems. And it was just vague enough that, there's plausible deniability. Oh, no, we're not threatening him. But at the same time, it had a very strong feel of, that's a nice empire you have there. Be a shame if something regulated it.
Exactly. And it brings to mind the Roman Emperor Caligula, who famously wrote laws, placed them very high up above the ground, but written in such a small hand. So no one was entirely sure what the law was. Now, I think that's probably an apocryphal story, but this is what the Nazis did. This is what the case was in the Soviet Union. All authoritarian regimes don't want you to actually know what you can get in trouble for. So you walk on eggshells and never take any risks. And that's how they control people. It's really the fear that maybe you are breaking the law, rather than explicitly outlawing every activity you could possibly take. And that's what they're doing here. They're not saying this would violate the law. And if they were to point to something, it would be ridiculous, to say to have a conversation with someone and publicly post it. As a matter of fact, even the United Auto Workers are going after them as well. They filed a complaint, I believe, with the NLRB this morning. I could be wrong on that, or they might be going to court. But basically, they're suing Musk and Trump for unfair labor practices, for saying that unions slow down the economy and make things less efficient in the conversation, claiming that is undue intimidation of people who might unionize in the future, even though it was not directly said to any of their employees. It's just a public forum. So I don't think that their case has any merits, but this is the authoritarian tendency we're dealing with here. And in Europe, unlike in this country, it actually has purchase, which is why they're trying to export it here as well.
All right, let's shift gears. Let's talk about your article about European tech protectionism is grounding our flights. And talk to me, first of all, when it comes to protectionism in the European Union, what does that look like?
So this is very similar to what we were just talking about. Again, they've crushed their own tech innovators, and now they want to export those terrible regulations to the United States. So our tech companies that are successful can't be either. The European Union fundamentally is a tariff cartel. So I remember during the Brexit debate, there was all this talk about how the Brexiteers were anti-free trade. It's like, well, no, the European Union is not a free trade zone. It's full of internal controls that have been carved out for various local interest groups, right? Scottish wool was protected from Polish competition, for example, before Brexit. So, in addition to that, they have massive tariffs against the rest of the world. I mean, this was the whole threat with Brexit, right? It was like, well, we're going to be outside the club, which means that they'll be applying extreme protectionist measures to you. So the idea that the leave side of that debate were the protectionists is pretty ridiculous. But the European Union has all kinds of tariffs. They have all kinds of laws governing whether or not data can be exported across the sea. They currently have an over $1 billion fine they're trying to extract from Meta for having people's data flows travel internationally. So that's the kind of thing that they do. They make it really difficult to penetrate their market, but simultaneously make it impossible to actually get off the ground. So, we can play the little game I have in the first paragraph of my piece here, which is, can you name any major tech company that has come out of Europe in the past 15 years other than Spotify? So that's always the counterexample. Spotify is the only one that got away, and now it's, of course, relocated to the US. But other than them, there's been no other tech innovation in the European Union because their regulations make it impossible to actually turn a profit there. So now, not just the United States, but China and even India, which can't win more than 3 medals and no gold at the Olympics, their tech sector is outpacing Europe's. I mean, this is incredible. I mean, they shouldn't be able to do this. Europe has the most educated workforce in a huge domestic market, but their regulators have made it impossible. So then they have to rely on American companies to come in and serve their market instead. Guess what? They then raid their coffers, and they're implying over $1 billion fines to Meta, to Microsoft, to Apple, to Google, and French regulators just said NVIDIA is next.
Okay, so I'm asking a really obvious question. I mean, this should really be self-evident, but is there any reason for a tech company to want to put down roots in the European Union, understanding that that's the kind of regulatory burden they're going to have to bear right from the start?
So for the time being, it's such a huge consumer market that, yes, it is worth the cost. And it's certainly 10, 15 years ago, getting your foot in the door made sense. And so in 2019, for example, Microsoft came to an agreement with the EU that they would allow kernel access, which is a technical term. It means they would basically, not wall off their operating systems in the way that, say, Apple does, where they're able to ensure robust cybersecurity and they're able to easily upgrade all their equipment, but it's not really interoperable with anything else. Microsoft is much more open, it's much more interoperable, and they've agreed to keep it that way with the EU. But as a result, they can't upgrade things in tandem. So this recent CrowdStrike outage, I mean, this is basically the result of one software vendor updating their system in a way that suddenly became incompatible with Microsoft. They can't do the same thing because of this agreement with the EU. And so now you have flights crashing, or not crashing, you have flights grounding, you have computers crashing, and you have Sky News going off the air. And then the worst part of it is they're turning around and they want to do the same thing to Apple now with this with a new bill they're considering at the moment. So it's really an insane way to serve or not serve your market.
Again, we are talking with James Erwin. He's a Young Voices contributor. Where can people follow you on social media?
You can find me on X at Erwin1854 while X is still allowed to operate around the world. And the Find the piece of the Washington Examiner was out on Friday.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Glad you could join us, and we are happy to welcome back to the program, back by popular demand, Matt Cookson joins us again as a Young Voices contributor. And Matt, for those who didn't get to meet you, I think it was just last week we had you on, but tell us just a little bit about yourself for those hearing you for the first time.
Yeah, so my name is Matt Cookson. Currently, I work in the defense industry in a supply chain role, and politics is something that is of great interest to me. Definitely want to develop my skills as a writer and work to contribute in the Liberty Movement. I've interned at a few different think tanks in my career, the Heritage Foundation, the Idaho Freedom Foundation, and would love to jump back into the political world at some point. So I'm definitely excited to be a part of Young Voices and to be on Moving Forward today.
Well, I'm looking at an article you wrote for realclearmarkets.com. Trump tariffs betray GOP promises to voters. Now that I think back on it, Trump was pretty big on tariffs back when he was president. Ostensibly, this is to protect Americans' jobs, but talk to me about where does he stand on tariffs now? I've always kind of been opposed to him just from the standpoint of it's a tax, and generally I oppose taxes, but has Trump changed his tune at all from when he was in office regarding tariffs?
Well, it's interesting. That's always been a huge part of his brand, and he's kind of doubled down on that idea and in terms of his pick of J.D. Vance as a vice presidential candidate. But what I'm getting at with that title is less that Trump has been inconsistent about tariffs and more about how he is betraying an opportunity to really market the GOP differently from the Democrats. The Democrats have really been about expanding government, opposing free speech, opposing free markets, and that kind of thing. Whereas the GOP is definitely more seen as the party of business and the party of liberty. And so on the tariff issue, Trump has an opportunity to set himself apart from the Democrats and identify himself as we are the party of freedom, and that's what we're doing here.
And let's talk specifically about the promises that the GOP has made to voters that a continuation of that tariff policy would actually run counter to.
Yeah, exactly. The GOP has, interestingly enough, in recent decades, become more of the party of the working man, whereas the Democrats have shifted to become the party of the elite. And obviously, the United States is not the manufacturing hub it used to be. And we've been hearing from politicians for decades that if we brought in tariffs or got better trade deals, then we could bring all these manufacturing jobs back. The sad reality is that is just not the case. For a variety of reasons, places like Mexico and India and China have become more attractive destinations for manufacturing hubs. And so the question is, how do we enact policies as a government that does the greatest good for the greatest amount of people? Because, we like to think in politics in terms of what are the solutions? Well, as the great Thomas Sowell once said, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And the problem with tariffs is that those in favor of them don't tell us what the trade-offs are if we enact them.
Okay, no, fair enough. So let's talk a little bit about what are some of the things that perhaps Trump or maybe those who are helping to guide his campaign don't understand about tariffs. In other words, is there an economic 101 kind of course? Could we sit Thomas Sowell down with him and have him explain a little bit about what those tariffs actually mean?
Well, as you suggested at the end there, that would be the easiest solution. Just get Trump in a room with Thomas Sowell and let them hash it out. But yeah, the problem with tariffs is a really simple thing. On their face, they are designed to punish foreign companies and nations that would wish to bring in goods from outside and, in effect, hurt working class Americans. The problem is that those companies and countries rarely pay the price for the tariffs. And what you end up seeing is that the effect of raising tariffs and in effect raising prices is you end up hurting the working class Americans the most, because those tariffs are ended up paid in the form of higher prices.
So I know Trump, you mentioned in your article, campaigned on tariffs, saying, look, we're getting ripped off in our trade deals with China, with Canada, with Mexico. But if we were to do away with tariffs, what's the risk, either from his point of view or in reality? What really are we risking if America stops imposing tariffs on those imported goods?
Well, what we're risking is increased competition. And as we know, nobody likes competition. I think we all would love it if we could get some sort of a law passed saying people aren't allowed to compete with us.
Sure.
And it kind of holds on to this pie in the sky type of world where we look glowingly at the past and don't want to face the facts that we may not be as competitive as we used to be. And I think that is a difficult challenge, certainly for any business, is how do you get more competitive? And the problem is that when you enact tariffs, it doesn't help you to correct the problems that you may have with your own business or your own economy. It just kind of like buries them, and you don't end up actually dealing with the main issue.
So the upside of competition is it makes you sharper.
Exactly. As we know from watching any sport, if you're a baseball fan or a football fan, the way you get a team better is not by saying we're not allowed to bring in better players into the league. Bringing in better players forces the players you currently have either to get better or give way to somebody who can do the job better, and that is something that impacts the economy all the way down. It forces out maybe businesses that aren't doing things as efficiently, or it forces greater innovation in companies that are able to adapt.
So we've got about 3 minutes before we have to wrap up, but I have two things I want to ask you about. One, let's talk about how tariffs can interfere with our military being at the top of its game. And secondly, I'd like you to talk to me about the Jones Act and why it should be repealed.
Sure. So national security is a big topic that is frequently raised in defense of tariffs. What it neglects to mention is that in order to support our military industrial base, we have to put natural resources and raw materials into the base in order to manufacture the goods we need to defend our country. So when you restrict the potential sources that you can use to buy those raw materials, you, one, may be excluding a potential excellent source for raw materials, and two, you may end up increasing the cost. And so your second point about the Jones Act basically says it restricts it restricts trading law to ships that have been built and staffed and owned in the United States. And the problem with that is that it doesn't do anything about the cost of building ships within the United States. And that has, in the long run, led to increased costs for shipping goods overseas, and it has prevented us from maintaining the fleet we use to ship goods over the sea.
I mean, it seems like you're making a very strong case here that, yes, it may protect some of our industries from competition, but protecting them from competition in some ways shortchanges them to the chance to improve themselves, to be more efficient, to be better at what they're doing. Not to be redundant, more competitive, but ultimately it would save money to the end consumer if they were able to do their job better and more competitively. But the only way they're going to do that, it sounds like, is if there's actually, somebody breathing down their neck, a competitor.
That's exactly right. Economics isn't always a pretty process, but free markets is the best system for providing the greatest number of goods at the greatest cost. And when we let that market do its job, the invisible hand, as it were, the results may not be pretty, but it is the most efficient way in terms of developing innovation and producing and procuring the goods that we need to live our daily lives.
Okay, again, we are talking with Matt Cookson. He is a Young Voices contributor as well as wears a bunch of other hats. Matt, where can people find you and follow you on social media?
Yeah, they can follow me on X. I tweet out my articles, and Matt Cookson 95 on X. So if you want to see more of the articles I'm working on, give me a follow.